We are going live. Over to you, Murli.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to introduce our co-host of this masterclass, Mr. Alok Narayan, founder, director, Emergence Learning System. And with me, thank you, Pallavi, for making everything possible for us. In fact, last evening during the curtain session and in today's inaugural session, CEOs talked about how we survived during the pandemic and now in the process of reviving their business and then will thrive a post-pandemic situation. The companies that emerge stronger and reviving faster and gearing up to thrive powerfully will be the ones that address three critical factors in coming months: cost, speed, and resilience, where quality is given on a robust digital platform. We hear just now before the session from Manoj saying the similar thing, that this is the digital who is going to change the play of the game in a very, very significant way, and we don't have any option. But for many companies, the need to reduce cost while doing minimal harm to key capabilities is obvious. Revenues, profits, and cash flows are dipping for most of the businesses, which we all have been experiencing. The ability to respond quickly to changing circumstances will have a major impact on companies' ability to control the damage and make the most of new opportunities. Companies have been made painfully aware of fragility of the critical systems upon which they depend and of the need for resilience. Resilience will determine how many of today's Fortune 100 companies will still be ranking in 2022. So this is the kind of situation we are into. Agility at scale is the corporate capability that can move the needle on all these three factors simultaneously, that is cost, speed, and resilience. A strong alignment around purpose, strategy, and priority means teams can work independently in an easy manner while improving resilience. Stronger alignment between team and business goals combined with fewer handovers and better coordination of roles by effectively utilizing digital transformation and adoption builds higher people and process excellence. And this has been reiterated several times by the CEOs who joined panel yesterday and today since morning, and including HR business leaders, senior leaders. They have been very, very supportive and very vocal about this. In organizations where the team have been materially more productive and motivated during the COVID-19 are those who had already been using agile principles in their business and turned around strategies using the art and science of digitization. So this was the entire context where we thought of doing this masterclass, and I feel really privileged to introduce a highly profound and a brilliant academician and a super business accelerator who is going to lead this masterclass today. For more than 30 years at MIT Sloan, he has taught MBA and executive education courses in operations strategy, supply chain management, quality management, and innovation in a far more significant way. And I've been a student, so I'm a proud student of the gentleman who's going to drive this masterclass. He led the collaboration between MIT Sloan and Indian School of Business on curriculum development and was a founding co-director of MIT Tata Center for Technology and Design and a founding co-director of MIT's Communications Futures program. In his famous book, Clock Speed, Winning a Strategy Control in the Age of Temporary Advantages, he draws on a decade's worth of research at MIT Sloan School of Management, United States, to introduce new terminology for understanding the forces of competition and making strategic decisions that will determine the destiny of our company as well as our industry. So this is a really powerful piece of work by the MIT Sloan researchers and the professor who is going to lead this masterclass. His recent research focuses on the development of principles for entrepreneurial companies to build operations strategies and capabilities consist of their business objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Professor Charles Fine, Chrysler LGO Professor of Management at MIT Sloan School of Management, United States, and CEO and President and Dean Asia School of Business in collaboration with MIT Sloan and Bank Negara of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Professor Fine has done his undergrad in Mathematics and Management Sciences from Duke University and MS in Operations Research and PhD in Business Administration and Decision Sciences from Stanford University, United States. Thank you, Charlie, for accepting our request. And I welcome you and hand over the baton to you to lead us through this masterclass. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Murray, for the invitation. And I think you have to mute because you have an echo. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the organizers for your hospitality in hosting me, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with the entire group. And I wonder if we could put up my slides, please, just to the cover slide. So as Murray mentioned, I've taught at MIT for my entire career at 38 years, but the last 6 years I've been spending a fair amount of my time. Just go back up one slide to the cover slide. MIT Sloan School started a new business school in collaboration with the Central Bank of Malaysia, and I've been serving as president, CEO, and dean of that business school, so the Asia School of Business. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts that both come from my teaching and research at MIT, but also my experience as leading a startup business school in Asia to try to connect Asia and the U.S. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And so I've been in Asia for 6 years now. Prior to moving to Malaysia, I had been to Asia many times, but never to live for a significant period of time. So I consider myself to be a student of Asian culture and Asian business and Asian nations. And so as a student of Asian culture, I've run across this symbol periodically, the symbol of yin and yang, which I've come to understand to mean to denote the search for harmony or the search for balance among competing forces. So you have forces that might push in different directions, the light and the dark, the male and the female, the good and the bad, if you will. And these forces, one tries to find balance or harmony in these forces. And I've tried to take that lesson to think about management at some level. And next slide, please. So I put here a hypothesis: innovation and growth require the yin and yang, or the balance of creativity and discipline. So I think my field, as Murray mentioned, is operations management as my original training. But more recently, I've worked and taught in the domain of innovation and entrepreneurship. And in operations management, historically, we focus on operations excellence, lean excellence, agile, and a high focus on discipline. Designing processes, adhering to those processes, standardization, repeatability, etc. And oftentimes when you find people who are very good at disciplined operations, they're not very good at creativity sometimes, that they resist change because they get their processes refined, they're running well, everything's working, and then they don't want creatives coming in kind of trying to make changes to their well-running processes. So sometimes the disciplined people push the creatives away. On the other hand, the creatives who want to bring in experimentation, improvement, trial and error, they tend to say, well, I don't want any constraints on me. I have to be able to think outside the box. I reject the discipline approach. And so sometimes you see there is tension, and one needs to find a balance in the organization between creativity and discipline. So I think that's a lesson also for the COVID times as well. Obviously, that COVID has forced all of us to have to be creative in many, many ways. That the way we were doing things pre-COVID changed dramatically, or we were forced to change dramatically, and all the discipline processes that we had, many of them were no longer viable in the COVID environment, and so we had to be creative. On the other hand, we still needed our organizations to be able to deliver products, deliver services, address customer needs, address employee needs. So you need a certain amount of discipline to be able to do that at the same time that you're exercising this creativity to change and to adapt. So I think this model of just trying to understand how we find this balance between creativity and discipline is a model that carries us from pre-COVID times into post-COVID times as well. Next slide, please. So I put here, the bar for success keeps rising, right? So on the one hand, we need to maintain creativity and discipline. But at the same time, we have to go digital. Obviously, digitization has been accelerated by COVID times, and organizations that were behind in the digitization process found they really had to rush and run to catch up. At the same time, we have to be agile and be able to change and respond quickly, and we have to be frugal. That in difficult economic times, one has to be very careful with one's resources, and so that raises the bar on the requirements. And can we go to the next slide, please? Slide number 5. So in addition to having to be frugal and agile and digital, our organizations are also being asked to be innovative, constantly coming up with new ideas, new products, new services, new ways of doing business. Be entrepreneurial, that is to explore new paths, to try to find new ways to do things, to maintain customer intimacy. So we have to stay on top of what our customer needs are, customer requirements, customer expectations, with operations excellence. So we have to do all this with high efficiency, high repeatability, high quality, with great leadership. We're being asked to have our leaders be able to get out in front of this, and in a constantly changing environment. So I think the expectations for organization leaders today are incredibly high, and I know there is quite a few people in this audience who are in the human resources area, and so the expectations for the training, the education, the growth, the development of the leadership team and the management team in our organizations also very, very highly taxed in some sense to achieve all of these multiple objectives. Very, very challenging. Next slide, please. So for many organizations, this implies continual transformation. I mean, transformation is another one of the post-COVID buzzwords, if you will, that if we have this constantly changing environment and these very, very high demands for performance, then there's a constant need for how do we transform, how do we continue to be able to change, to be able to adapt. And the first months of the pandemic were different from the second months of the pandemic, and the current months of the pandemic are different yet. And we all expect that by a few months from now, it will be yet different again. And so we can't, no matter how much change we've accomplished and how much success we've accomplished, we can't say, okay, our transformation is done. We have to be prepared for continual change. Next slide, please. So we might ask, well, what does transformation look like from the, if you will, from the pre-COVID era to the post-COVID era? And so I have maybe a little metaphorical image to suggest that. So next slide, please. So we might say, okay, here's our legacy system. This is pre-COVID. We were in operation. We were connected in the ways we needed to be to our value chain, to our customers, our suppliers, our employees. And then next slide, please. All of a sudden, we have to start connecting to the cloud. We have to do more things digital, bigger challenges. Next slide, please. Then we have IoT everywhere. We've got more complexity, more challenge, and so things are getting really complicated. And then next slide, please. And then all of a sudden, startups come along, and they're very, very different, right? These startups are born digital. They don't have the complexity, the legacy systems that we saw in the previous era. And so next slide, please. So there is now this competition that the legacy players on the left, they may have systems that look complex, look outdated, look fragile, look very slow. The new competitors come in, they're frugal, they're agile, they're digital, very, very different requirements and very, very different situations. Next slide, please. And so that suggests that in some cases we need radical transformation. That is, if a legacy company on the left has to now compete with a new entrant on the right, it's not a question of, oh, we'll just snip a few wires or replace a few light bulbs or make a few new connections. It's a very, very dramatic difference and expectation that's required to transform. So I'm not saying that every organization faces this kind of a situation, but I think there are many organizations that found themselves feeling and looking a little bit like the legacy side, and then needing to. So we need a certain amount of digital transformation. That's the buzzword of the year, I think, buzzword of the COVID year. Digital transformation can make a huge difference. On the left side, improve customer satisfaction. So customers have very different requirements post-COVID. How do we satisfy them? Digitization gives us a way to be connected and to connect our value chains. Digitization also enables new products and services. So there are products and services we can offer with a high degree of digitization that we were not able to offer previously. And third, digitization can improve productivity. So improve the effectiveness of our human resources, of our capital resources, and in this need for frugality, how do we have to think about productivity? So there's a question in the comment box: how are the legacy firms going to compete with the new generation firms? Should the legacy firm leave the business? So I think that's a very important question, and I think there are some legacy firms that have found that they are not well equipped to compete in this new environment, and there have been bankruptcies of many organizations in this environment. Just to give a very simple example, I have a colleague who lives in New York City, in Manhattan, and he says you walk down the major boulevards in Manhattan, and some of the restaurants are boarded up and closed and went out of business, and some of the restaurants have set up on the sidewalks. They're serving people outdoors, and they seem to be thriving. They have delivery people coming in and out to do delivery. They also have some outdoor service. And so these restaurants, literally right next door to each other, some of them figured out a way to survive, and some of them didn't. So, and maybe they started in the same place, but they had different leadership, different ability to change the culture, different ability to react. So I think where you start in a legacy situation does not absolutely determine your fate, but your ability to change, your ability to transform, your ability to react and experiment and explore, be agile, affect your employees' ability to be effective. All of these are factors that make the difference between the business that shuts down and the business that thrives. So I don't think that we should write off the legacy firms, but I think we have to be aware that the legacy firms must take transformation to heart in every way, shape, and form, and that's some of what I want to talk about in the slides. So the left-hand side maybe is a little bit about why we need to do digital transformation, what good it does, what's difficult about it. Well, one commonly noted feature is that organizational change is often resisted. That many of us as human beings like to become comfortable in a particular routine. That we develop our preferred ways of doing things, our preferred ways of communicating, our preferred ways of working, our preferred people that we work with. And I think as human beings, we all seek a certain amount of comfort from familiarity, from a certain amount of constancy. And when we're faced with the need to change dramatically, there's a resistance. There's a resistance often at the individual level, resistance at the organizational level. This is natural. I think it's very human, but I think the difference between those who survive and thrive and those who struggle and potentially fail is partly and to a significant degree due to their ability to make this change, to change the way they work, the way they operate, and even the very cultural fabric of the organization, which I'll talk about a little more in a few minutes. Second point, legacy systems can be hard to replace and upgrade. So the photographs I showed you of the telephone wires and electrical wires, that's a messy system, and many organizations have systems that maybe look like that and require a certain amount of work to upgrade them, to replace them. A certain amount of capital costs, but there's also a certain amount of human investment in making those changes. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Post-COVID, what, according to you, would be lead and lag measures for the HR function to measure people excellence? So I'm gonna come to that in a few minutes. That is, I want to talk about people and culture in a few slides. So I'm going to hold off on that question, and I'll keep going on. But I encourage the questions in the chat. I'll try to monitor them as we go. So the third point I put on the right side of this slide: requisite skills are in scarce supply. So leadership skills. All organizations have leaders, but not all those leaders have the same level of skill in leading, and particularly the same level of skill in leading in these very difficult times, in these times of significant change. So if we're going to face the first point, that is organizational change is resisted, we need organizational leaders who can overcome that resistance to avoid the fate of being the organization that's not able to adapt. And then we also need the technical skills, the skills of how to use the technologies of cloud and the technologies of AI and the modern technologies. Okay, next slide, please. So this simple diagram is just intended to show that sometimes transformations can be quite discontinuous. That if we think about how industry progresses, how technologies progress, how organizations progress, sometimes it's smooth and incremental. You get over time a little bit improvement, a little bit more improvement, and you get continuous improvement or incremental improvement. But sometimes there are jumps. Sometimes there are discontinuous changes, and obviously the COVID situation is a situation where for many organizations the transformation was discontinuous. So all of a sudden, a large fraction of the way that people work, a large fraction of the people, a large fraction of the value chain relationships change almost overnight, and you have a very, very dramatic situation, and that calls for a very different kind of leadership, a very different kind of teamwork, very different kind of exploration as compared to the continuous improvement. Continuous improvement, in some senses, easier for organizations to manage, easier to stomach, easier for people to adapt continuously and incrementally. It's the radical change that can be so challenging. Next slide, too, please. So just some of you maybe are too young to have ever seen the gold box of Kodak film, which is depicted here. Maybe some of you remember when photographs used to be were done by our mobile devices, but were done with film and cameras. And Kodak, it was more or less invented the photography industry about 100 years ago, and over that 100-year period developed continuous improvement. That is, every year they could make a little bit better film, a little bit better photographs, a little bit better cameras, and over time the performance of photography got better and better and better. And then along came the discontinuous change of digital photography. The photography of Kodak was celluloid film, separate cameras, photographs printed out on paper, and literally people would have to mail their box of film in, and then they get the digital print, the paper prints mailed back to them. So Kodak, it was an extraordinarily profitable company, and it made its money by selling film, these little gold boxes of film, and selling the paper and selling the photograph development that was part of the value chain. A very, very profitable business. So the profit margins on this little box were on the order of 80 or 90%. Kodak had made a lot of money. They had very large R&D labs, and in fact, Kodak invented in their R&D labs digital photography. So digital photography was invented by Kodak, but the board of directors of Kodak said, we do not want to introduce digital photography in the marketplace, even though our R&D engineers invented it, because we don't have a business model for that. We make our money selling film and selling paper. There's no film to be sold with digital photography. There's no paper to be sold. How are we going to make money? It's a bad idea. We don't want to use it. And so they missed the digital change. Probably the person who's made more money from digital photography than anyone else is Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. Facebook was founded as an organization that demonstrated digital photographs on their website. That's what they did. And then they figured out how to post ads on that. And so today we have digital photography dominating the profit opportunities in advertising, and huge amounts of money have been made. But Kodak couldn't make that transformation. They didn't see, they invented the technology, but they couldn't invent the business models and the organizational models to see how to use digital photography, and they missed that transformation. So that's very different from the COVID transformation, but it's a discontinuous transformation, and I think it's just a helpful example to see how radically these technologies change our opportunities. Okay, so let me go to the next slide, please. So what are the pillars of digital transformation? So I put here 4: strategy, technology, operations, and people. So if we're going to be successful in digital transformation, we need to have a strategy. So I think that first and foremost, that's what Kodak lacked. They didn't have a strategy for how we're going to make money with this digital technology. So they invented the technology. They were strong in operations. They had very good people, but they had no strategy for how to go forward. So we really need to think about all these. Next slide, please. And are they equally important? Okay, so let's look at some data about digital transformation. So next slide, please. So in a relatively recent study of enterprises that undertook a digital transformation project or program, 73% of those enterprises said that they failed to provide any business value from their digital transformation. So they put in the effort and they got nothing back. 78% failed to meet their business objectives, and only 22% achieved what they had hoped for in terms of their business results. So digital transformation is not easy. So I said in that Manhattan street, maybe 50% of the restaurants made it and 50% failed. Well, in this example, only less than a quarter of the businesses that tried to do digital transformation were successful. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, when you ask organizations what's the biggest hurdle, why they failed, what was the struggle, where did things go wrong, the majority of organizations cite culture as the #1 hurdle to digital transformation. So it's not that they can't figure out cloud. It's not that they can't figure out AI systems. It's not that they can't figure out IoT. It's that they can't figure out people. They can't figure out how to change the culture and change the organization to adapt to digital mindset, digitization, and that requires a transformation of mindset. So we in some sense, I think we see that the technologies get a lot of press, but the challenges are oftentimes in the people who have to work with those technologies, not purely in the technologies. Next slide, please. And so a little bit of backup on this data. So this was from a survey in multiple countries around the world, and digital cultural issues were the number one cause of challenges. Number two is this presence of archaic IT systems and applications. So the legacy systems that I showed you, the photograph imagery of the telephone pole, that was number two, right? So it's not only culture, it's not only the people, but the people and the culture are a huge part. And as HR professionals, that's the challenge that is faced in the HR organizations. And how do we grow our people and grow our organizations to adapt? So I see a question in the chat, but in 2020 the mindset may have shifted. So I think that's true. That sometimes, so in the organizational change literature, you see that many researchers have found that when people go through an emotional experience, they're more likely to change than if it's a less emotional experience. So the more intense the emotional experience, the more open people become to change. And certainly COVID has provided that emotional experience for many people and for many organizations, that it was a shock. It came as a shock, and that in some sense opened many people's minds to the need to change. Next slide, please. So one of the famous management thinkers, Peter Drucker, who wrote many books about management and leadership, had a famous quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," right? So I interpret this to mean no matter how good your strategy is, no matter how well you plan things out, how well you've budgeted, how well you've laid out all the plans, if your culture cannot adapt, then you cannot, the culture will overwhelm the strategy. So in some sense, HR professionals and HR organizations own the keys to digital transformation. That it's not necessarily the IT department that holds the keys to transformation, it's the HR department. And so what can HR do? How does HR go forward to bring about this transformation? Okay, next slide, please. So some of the research on changing culture, company culture says for digital disruption, you need to be more agile. We sort of mentioned that word earlier, the ability to move quickly, to change, to iterate, to be flexible. You need to be risk tolerant and experimental. So this can be a huge challenge for some organizations because in many organizations, people are punished for mistakes. People are punished for failures. But when you're in an environment where there's no roadmap, there's no absolute right path, we're experimenting and exploring to find the new way, we have to take chances. We have to take risks. And the organization that punishes the risk-taking, punishes failed experiments, discourages people from engaging in the learning processes that are required for changing the culture and changing the organization. So unfortunately, we don't have a blueprint that for every given organization of this is exactly how you do it, how it should go, what you should look like at the end. It's a learning process that we have to feel our way and find our way. And in order to feel and find our way, we have to experiment. And if we're going to experiment, we're going to have some experiments that work and some experiments that fail. And if we don't tolerate risk and we don't tolerate failure, it will be very, very difficult to communicate a culture that can go forward in this kind of an environment. So earlier in the presentation, I said, I think we should expect an environment of continual transformation. It's not that there's just one-time shock and we have to make this one-time transformation. Rather, I think what people's eyes are now open to is that transformation is going to be continuous. Change is going to be continuous. We're not going to go back to where we were in 2019, but we're also not going to likely be as stable as we were in 2019 for quite some time. And so it's not a one-time thing. It's a continual learning, continual experimentation, continual need for agility and risk tolerance as we go forward. Next slide, please. So we want to be able to ask, do you have the right culture? Does your culture accept risk and tolerate failure? Does your culture embrace new ways of doing things, new ways of working with new technology? And what is your culture with regard to speed versus perfection? So this is a very, very challenging issue, I think, that on the one hand, in a change environment, you want the experimentation to be rapid. You have to trial and error should go quickly. Okay, let's try this. If it didn't work, let's try that. If it didn't work, we'll try something else. So we need to be able to quickly do our experiments, quickly do our learning. But on the other hand, we can't really experiment at the expense of the customer, right? So while if we're not at perfection, we're trying to serve the customer this way, we're trying to serve them that way, we're trying this new process. But the customer still expects a high level of service, a high level of quality, and there's this challenge that in a time of change, the expectations are not necessarily diminished, but the requirement for speed and experimentation are high. So that's a tension. It's a little bit of a yin and yang tension there between speed and perfection. We need both, but they push against each other a little bit. Next slide, please. So I want to do kind of a little bit of a deep dive on culture. I see in the chat, it's good to divide smaller teams focused on particular solutions and conquer speed and perfection. I think that's a nice point. That you don't want to think of the whole organization as monolithic. That you may want to break into smaller teams, and each team works towards solutions. So where do cultures come from? I want to kind of do a deep dive a little bit on culture. Okay, so next slide, please. So one way that cultures get generated is that it's kind of organizational learning, that the organization has a certain amount of kinds of assumptions about what works and doesn't work. It engages in practices. It figures out what's worked. And there's a reinforcing feature here that if you hit upon a set of assumptions and a set of practices that seem to bring success to the organization, then that gets communicated in the organization. This is the way we do things. This is our culture. We work in this way. We act in this way. We communicate in this way because it's been successful for us. And so the assumptions and practices that lead to success, that seem to work, become perceived as the reality of this is the way the world should work, and this is the way our culture should work. This is the way our people should work. Next slide, please. So cultural assumptions exist because at one point they worked. But what happens when they stop working? Right? What happens when the world changes and all of a sudden the things that used to work don't work anymore? So for example, there may have been a culture in an organization, we want to minimize capital costs and seek out cheap labor. Right? And so that's embedded in the culture that we always want to avoid capital investment. Rather, let's invest in low-cost labor. Let's seek out low-cost labor. That becomes part of our culture until someday maybe that stops working, and all of a sudden, oh my goodness, we need higher skilled labor and we need more investment in capital, digital assets, for example. That's a transformation that's not necessarily easy, and the cultural change doesn't come easy. That the kinds of people you're looking for may change, and the way that you think about investments may change, the way that you act in your investment committees may change, and it's not easy necessarily to make those adjustments. Another cultural assumption might be we divided work into small units for each individual to perform independently. So people work independently in the organization. That's our culture. Give everyone a task or a set of tasks. They do it. That we're not so group-oriented or team-oriented. We try to be individual-oriented, and that works until it doesn't work. And then it's one day, all of a sudden, we need a lot more collaboration across the teams. We need to do things differently, and then and we have to change. So changing culture is necessary when old assumptions no longer work. Okay, so our culture is our set of assumptions about and our habits and our routines, and all of a sudden the way we used to do things doesn't work anymore. It can be very painful and difficult. So I'll give just a simple example, which is not a work example, but I spent most of my life in the United States. In the United States, we drive on the right-hand side of the road. When I came to Malaysia 6 years ago, Malaysians drive on the left side of the road. And so for most of my life, I learned to drive on the right side of the road. My habits were to drive on the right side of the road. I knew I was safe if I stay on the right side of the road. I don't have to think about it anymore that I stay on the right side of the road. It's automatic. My brain doesn't have to think about, gee, where should I put my vehicle on the road? And then all of a sudden you have to drive on the left side of the road, and it can be scary. Am I on the correct side of the road? I have to think about this. And I'm going to talk in a moment about fast thinking and slow thinking, but you have to go from fast thinking, that is, I knew how to do things. It was habitual. I didn't even have to think about it anymore of how I did my work, because the culture is so deeply embedded in me. All of a sudden, I have to think harder about how I do my work, and I have to do it in a different way, and it can be painful. And I put here, that often entails worse before better trade-offs. That is, things are going to get worse before they get better. That is, we're going to have to slow down. We're going to have to figure out new things. We're going to have a lot of trial and error. And some organizations, this is another version of tolerating risk and tolerating failure, that we have to expect that the first day of a change is not going to be better than the day before, but rather there's a learning period where things are going to be worse before they're better, as we're building our new habits, our new ways of working, our new culture. Next slide, please. And so cultural assumptions can become deeply embedded in sort of the physics of the organization, that the structures that we have influence the mental models, the way we think, and those mental models reinforce the structure. So if we just think about driving on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, if we have a mental model that we're going to drive on the left-hand side of the road, we organize our signs and our traffic signals and our pedestrian crossings and everything else, that is the structure we build around driving on the left side of the road. If we have to change our mental models, but we also have to change our structures. Next slide. We have an example from that's closer to HR. If there's an assumption in an organization, the culture is workers cannot be trusted. All right. So in some organizations, that's a component of the culture, that we can't trust people, and so we need surveillance and controls. So we put in place lots of surveillance, lots of controls. Some of those. Like I'm not being trusted, I'm going to see what I can get away with, or the company doesn't trust me, I don't trust them either. And if you want to change that culture, you not only have to change the mindsets, but you have to change the structures and the infrastructure of how we do business, how we interact with people, etc. Okay, I see an interesting question in the chat. What should HR do if strategy starts eating culture for lunch and dinner, instead of culture eating strategy? So I think strategy and culture really have to be thought about in a yin-yang relationship, right? That strategy, by its nature, looks forward. Culture, by its nature, is a reflection of the past. That is, it's a reflection of what has worked, what habits we've built up in the organization, what routines we've had, and so strategy wants to lead, wants to look forward and say, this is the situation we face. This is what we need to do. Culture has to adapt, if you will. But if the strategy gets too far ahead and tries to go in a direction that the culture can't adapt to, then culture is probably going to win. And so that's the strategy, culture eating strategy. Now, another question here: how do we align existing cultural artifacts with the overall vision between what's being preached and what's being practiced and who owns it, business leaders or HR, right? So I think that's related to what I was just saying, that we have these cultural artifacts, as noted in the chat, and then we have a strategy and a vision that's being promulgated by the senior leadership team, and the business leaders and HR have to work together in some sense. That HR's responsibility, in some sense, is to say to the business leaders, we understand what you're trying to do strategically. Let's think about what we can do culturally. What's feasible culturally? Because if the strategy gets too far ahead of the culture, then it's not going to work. On the other hand, we can't act as though the culture is immutable. The leaders have to demonstrate the new culture, and that's actually in the next slide or two, which I want to come to in a moment. So the next slide, please. So one more slide about culture, and then I want to talk about how leaders change culture. So the existing culture and ways of doing things can be deeply ingrained. I think I already made that point. And what's one aspect of culture? One aspect of culture might be the first point here. Employees are not empowered to take on new challenges, right? So there are some organizations where the culture says the people who have big titles make the decisions. They take on the new challenges. The people who have small titles just do what they're told, right? That is, some of our people are expected to use their minds and their hands. Some are just expected to use their hands. Don't use your mind. Turn off your brain when you come in. The senior people will do all the thinking for you. Well, that's not an easy process to defend when we need a significant cultural change. Everybody in the organization has to be engaged intellectually of understanding why do we have to change, what's going on here, what are the new rules of the game that we're trying to adapt to, and it makes it so much easier to get people to change if they understand why and if there's a consistent story as opposed to just do what you're told. So how do we empower employees to accept and be a part of taking on these new challenges? And there also may be a culture that people aren't compensated for learning new things. People are told, you do one thing, that's your job, don't look left, don't look right, just look straight ahead. And if your entire career you're told don't look right, don't look left, just look straight ahead, then when all of a sudden we need you to be agile, we need you to be flexible, we need you to grow, but your whole career we've been telling you, no, don't look left and don't look right, it's again a very, very difficult challenge. So the seeds of cultural change are planted long before the need for cultural change very often. And then there may not be incentives to break new ground and build new models. Okay, so I see a question in the chat. How can HR overpower the CEO in perception of culture infusion? I don't think it's a question of overpowering. I think it's a question of persuasion. It's a question of how do you marshal your facts and your stories of how do you translate what the CEO's vision is and the CEO's strategy is into what are the implications for the organization and for the culture, and then communicating back to the CEO that, okay, you say you want to do this. If that's the direction you want to go in, here's what we need our people to do. Here's what we need our culture to do. Here's where we are today, and look at the size of that gap. There's a gap between where we are today and where we need to be. So let's talk about how do we close that gap. It's not a question of overpowering the CEO. It's a question of persuading the CEO that of finding a path to get to where you want to get. Another question in the chat, what is one symptom or indication that the HR wing of an organization is not functioning well? So I think if the HR function reacts to strategic proposals and strategic change and strategic vision as with no, we can't do that, then I think that's not very functional, right? So the HR division has to come up with solutions, right? Or at least constraints or pathways. How do we get from here to there? Now, the CEO may say, I want to get from here to there in 1 year. And the HR department might say, well, we see a path to get there in 3 years. We don't see how to get there in 1 year. we'll show you the 3-year path, and then let's brainstorm about how to shrink that or something like that. So I think a well-functioning HR organization can have a rich dialogue with the senior leaders, the CEO, on how do we get there? How do we adapt our culture? What do we need to do? Okay, next slide, please. So I just kind of a little more dynamic, and maybe I've said some of this already, but I think culture begins with successful leaders who impose their own values and assumptions. So in a new organization, the leaders have a very significant opportunity to put their imprint on the organization culture. So the CEO or the leadership team says, we're going to act this way, we're going to work this way, this is the way we're going to function. And assuming that the organization becomes successful, the success reinforces the culture for later generations of managers. And I wrote here, the culture now defines the leadership. So if you're a new leader coming in, you're now constrained by the culture that was created by the previous leader. You don't have a blank slate. You're a prisoner to the existing culture, and in some sense, your smoothest path is to continue that culture. However, the second paragraph here, if the group runs into difficulties where some of the assumptions are no longer valid, then the leader has to step outside the culture and change the processes, right? So you know, there's a saying in playing poker, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them, right? So know when to hold them is in some sense know when to stay the course, know when, gee, this culture is working for us, this situation is working for us, we got to stay the course, keep the course, and know when to fold them is, well, we're going to have to shut down the way we're doing things and do things very differently. And in some sense, that's the job of the senior leadership team, with the aid of the HR team, obviously, is to make assessments about, gee, can we survive and continue to thrive more or less the way we're doing things? That is, are we in a situation of incremental improvement and incremental change, or are we in a situation where we need radical transformation and we really have to change, right? And so the third paragraph here says, the ability to perceive one's own culture and evolve the culture adaptively is the essence and ultimate challenge of leadership. So this is where the HR team also has to think about, how do we help the CEO and the CEO's team grow? How do we train them to be leaders in the sense of leaders of cultural change, and also perception, be able to be perceptive about the needs for cultural change and what we need to do differently. So I think we put a heavy load here on the senior leadership team in some sense, and we also put a heavy load on the HR organization when we think about culture. And as noted in the earlier slide, digital transformation, the hardest thing about digital transformation is the culture part. So in some sense, you can't do digital without going through culture, HR, and leadership. Next slide, please. Could I just ask the host, how many minutes do I have left? I've lost track of time.
So, Charlie, you can take 5 more minutes time. That would be fine.
5 more minutes. Okay, no problem. Thank you. Apologize for losing track here. So I think I've said that digital transformation requires human transformation and cultural change. So and then next slide, please. So there's a relatively famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow by an economist named Daniel Kahneman, and he won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years back for the research that led to this book. And he talks about what I was talking about earlier with the driving on the left-hand side of the road and driving on the right-hand side of the road, that when we have a well-established culture, we do, next slide please, what's called fast thinking. Our brains learn to do automatic processing, that we can work without thinking. If you think about someone who plays a musical instrument, when you're first learning to play a musical instrument like the piano, you go very slowly. Gee, which finger is supposed to press which key, and which key is which note? What's the right order of the notes? But if you watch a virtuoso concert pianist playing the piano, they seem to be doing it without thinking. It's automatic processing. They've done it so many times. They know how to do it. Same thing in sports. You see someone starting out, let's say in tennis, first day they take a tennis lesson. How do I hold the racket? How do I hold the ball? Where do I stand? Where do I hit the ball? You watch the experts. They do automatic processing. So the insight here is that there's two our brains have two modes. Our brains, every human has this, a fast thinking mode, things that we've mastered, where we process in an automatic way, and things that we're trying to figure it out as we go, where we have to go slow, we have to go deliberatively. It takes more work. It's much harder to operate in conscious processing mode. And so all of us in our work, no matter what our work is, as we become more experienced, we move more to automatic processing. And the thing about automatic processing is we don't spend as much time thinking about it. We just do. And if the world begins to change, sometimes we don't notice. We go into work every day and we do the same thing that we did before because we're on automatic. And as the world's changing, we don't necessarily adapt quickly. And then if you have to adapt suddenly, your whole world slows down. Everything has to be thought through slowly. You have to do conscious processing for every aspect of the work. And so when we go through a radical transformation, it's a strain, literally a strain on the brains of the people in the organization. That our brains have to work harder. It actually takes more energy of the human body devoted to the brain's activity when the brain is working in slow thinking or conscious processing as opposed to fast. And so it's difficult and it's painful. It's painful to have to make that adjustment sometimes, and so we struggle with it as individuals, and therefore we struggle with it as organizations. Next slide, please. So not only, so some of the failure modes in automatic processing, sometimes we'll fail to recognize a new problem. Sometimes we'll apply our automatic solutions to a new problem where we really should have been thinking slow, but we didn't realize it. And sometimes we miss the opportunity that, gee, we should be doing some breakthrough thinking here. So next slide, please. Cultural change requires that we have to break the old processes. Okay, I'm going to give just a couple more slides and then I'll wrap it up. So next slide, please. So this next slide is, I'm going to give you a homework assignment. So this is something to help you understand your organization culture. So what I will ask an organization to do is break into teams in your natural group, and ask each member of the team, let's see what are the 10 commandments of doing business in our organization. That is, what are the absolutes about how we operate? What are the things that we have to do in order to be a successful organization? And what are these assumptions that are kind of built in? And so what are the things that, in some sense, when we hire somebody new, the new person coming in is not going to know these things, and we have to teach them, here's the way we do business here. So what are the central features of our organizational culture? And also ask, how did we get to these features? Why do we act in this way? What's the legacy behind how our culture got this way? And then the hardest question, are these assumptions still valid? Right? Are they still functional? Are they still what we need to do in order to be successful? Okay. So if we could just go to the final slide in the deck, number 57, please. Yeah. So in summing up, I just want to comment that I think the bar for success, it does keep rising. It is very high. That we're expected to be frugal. That is, to make these changes with minimal investment, to be agile, to be able to constantly be flexible, to accomplish the digitization, but to get to build the cultures that need to go with them. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. I want to thank Merle and the team for inviting me, and I think if we have time for additional questions, we can take some in the chat or whatever the moderator prefers.
Charlie, thank you. A wonderful session. But I request, please take us through one slide, which is smart skill versus soft skill. That's something which I request you to take us through. That entire HR fraternity should realize what is the latest trend. I can see lots of questions around that.
Okay. All right.
So
sure.
Please, on that last slide at the cost of
okay.
time, which is fine.
So if I could ask if we could please go back to slide number 39, and I'll take a few moments for that.
Yes.
Slide number
Just
30.
give me a yes,
okay.
yes. Just give me a moment. I'm bringing it up.
All right. So I'll start off by saying there's a fairly long history of talking about what are called soft skills and hard skills, and typically hard skills are considered to be sort of things like mathematics and physics and computer programming, and soft skills are like teamwork and organizational leadership and things like that. And we've at the Asia School of Business, we've tried to reframe those skill sets into what we call smart skills and sharp skills. So what do we mean by smart skills? We don't like the word soft, because soft implies weak, implies and sort of almost implies less important, whereas smart implies something that everybody needs to be and needs to know. And so we talk about smart skills as the skills of being smart in organizational management and organizational operation, which I'll elaborate on in a minute. And sharp skills are the analytical skills. So next slide, please. So what are the sharp skills, right? So what are the skills that we want that everybody has to have for these days in analytics? So certainly the STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, management, mathematics, engineering, mathematics, statistics, linear programming, optimization, AI, blockchain, cloud, data analytics. So we need people in our organizations who are at the state of the art with these sharp skills. Next slide, please. But we also need the smart skills. The smart skills include emotional maturity, teamwork, leadership, followership, flexibility, ethics, open-mindedness, cognitive readiness. So let me say a minute something about what's cognitive readiness. What does that mean? So it means, in some sense, to have the psychological awareness to be ready for change. In my own organization, so as I said, I've been the CEO of a business school for the last 6 years. We do a reorganization once a year. And in the first few years, people complained about it. Oh, I was just learning my job, and now you're changing things, you're reorganizing. And what I say is that what I am doing is building in the organization cognitive readiness, ready for anything, ready for change. And when COVID hit our school, I was very proud of how quickly we were able to adapt to online learning, online meetings, everything off the cloud, etc. And it was, I feel, partly because our organization was cognitively ready for whatever might happen. That is, they were used to change. Change is part of the fabric of the organization. It's not something that only happens in an emergency. It's something that you build in to the organization's thinking. So we also teach this to our students. In our curriculum, our students spend about 1/3 of their total time working on projects in different countries in the ASEAN region, actually the whole Asian region. So mostly in ASEAN, in Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. But we've also done some projects in India and China, Japan, Korea, etc. And every semester we send the students to a different place and they do a project in a different country. And the first time they do it, it's painfully hard. I've never been to this country before. I don't speak the language. I don't understand the people. But by the time they graduate, they've had 5 projects in 5 different countries. They're cognitively ready for whatever happens. That is, they say, you can send me to a 6th country and I'll be ready. I don't know what I'll find, but I'm ready for the challenge. I'm ready to adapt. So that's kind of one example of the kind of smart skills that we try to build. And I think, and so we've developed a whole curriculum at Asia School of Business on smart skills and sharp skills. And we also find that when our students do their projects, oftentimes the client wants the sharp skills, that is, they want analytical work done, data analytics or whatever. But in order for the students to be effective in applying those sharp skills, they have to have the smart skills. They have to be able to work their way in the organization, to win support, to get people to collaborate with them, et cetera, and to work in teams. So, Murli, I don't know if that's what you want me to share, but I'm happy to
answer. That's a great point, Charlie, when our HR people are equally required to adopt the smart skills and sharp skills to fly in this circumstances in the country and in this globe. So thank you for the great points. While you have answered most of the questions in the way, we do have only one question to ask at this point of time. Rest everyone, we can answer later. Are all digital transformations makes organization agile by default, or agility is more to do with digital transformation outcome, something more? So is the agility or being agile is for granted by the digital transformation, or we need to do something more about it?
So I think, first, to a significant degree, I think you have to mute yourself again, Murli. To a significant degree, in order to accomplish digital transformation, the firm needs the organization needs some agile skills and agile capabilities. That digital transformation, as we said, is not a linear process. It's a trial and error process, an experimentation process, and agile teaches us to be experimental. It teaches us for trial and error. It teaches us to iterate. So it's not easy to go through the digital transformation process, which is a process. It's not just flipping a switch, if we don't have a certain degree of agility built into the organization and the processes and the way people think and the way people work.
Thank you.
I hope that's a helpful.
Great. I now hand over to our co-host, Mr. Alok Narayan, to take this proceeding forward. Alok, please.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Murli, and thanks a lot, Professor Fine. So I have the, I think, very interesting job of trying to bring out, what you spoke of and the key learnings that we have, and I'm going to do that on behalf of all our fellow participants here. So I'll make an attempt simply because Professor Fine, in the 55 odd minutes, what you've taken us through quite a ride, in fact. And I don't think this ride is about, you're driving on the right-hand side or left-hand side, but I think this was a ride in terms of sheer balance, what you've taken us through. What began, and this very wholesome treat is how I would term it. So what began as, what seemed initially very sort of, innocent and harmless almost, about your experience in saying that, okay, I am now in Malaysia last 6 years, what the culture within the Asian countries, what that means for you, and then to expand it and take it into the realm of what organizations actually currently they do struggle with change, transformation. So I'm just going to quickly outline some of what I have actually picked up, and I know that when it comes to internalizing it, it's almost like you have to build virtually a new muscle almost for what you've taken us through. So what I picked up right in the beginning was that when we speaking of, and that was your hypothesis, that the moment we speak of innovation and growth, so immediately we get into the creativity and discipline as virtually two very key aspects. Interestingly, a polarity there exists, and what you spoke of, which is almost like the dual, what can also happen within an individual and also within the organizations, and then has an impact. And I think that's what you further expanded on. Creatives may push disciplines away, and the disciplines may push creatives away. So again, the contrast, the dual there, and how what you spoke of, the balance between the two, that typically would come into play and would be of help. being agile, being frugal, being digital. And that's very much the theme of the National HRD, the current conference as well. So by way of saying that, okay, so how do we become agile and digital, how that helps, and at the same time, frugality, that has its value, of course. So operation excellence, what we did pick up was the link between that and also great leadership, and the fact that the process of transformation now happens to be continual. Why? Because the bar for success, that is something which continues to rise. You spoke then also of, the in fact, I thought some very interesting, and again, the metaphor that you brought out, the visual of the electricity, the electric poles. And I know that in many parts of the country, that is something we're familiar with, how that keeps getting more and more, complex. And one fine day that gets replaced by something which is, so clean looking, and at the same time, the fact that it is frugal, and the fact that digital has now taken over and the transformation has happened there. Then what I picked up and what you got into play was, so what is really good about when it comes to digital transformation and the aspects of how the changes are happening. So I'm not going to go into each and every aspect here, but how the legacy systems are not easy to replace or upgrade. And the fact that there is organization resistance and how the leaders need to overcome that. And I thought at many junctures, you continued to touch upon what role the HR department actually could play. And to be able to build that linkage, when it comes to the organization, the leadership, and HR as really holding that together. When you got into describing and sharing about the criticality of discontinuity enabling processes. So working on continuities, is relatively easy. Changes are incremental, and there is a degree of comfort, but maybe nothing is changing, and we are really not accomplishing what we need to. And at least when I saw the picture of Kodak, filled me with some amount of nostalgia, to see that, because that's not something we see very often. In fact, we don't see it at all. So I thought that was another wonderful metaphor of what happens if you're continuously only continuing to be in spaces which are perhaps comfortable. Not that you're not working on excellence, but the fact that you're ignoring perhaps or not being able to perceive and pick up what signals are being received from the market. And I thought this was very interesting when you got into that, how culture hence can become perhaps the number one hurdle. 62% of organizations, as you mentioned, cite culture as the number one hurdle. Now, again, this is interesting because this was a very interesting point of virtually a denouement for me as well, because what began as operational excellence, and now as we continue to peel the layers, getting into aspects which is more to do with leadership, culture, ability to manage that change, lead the change. And what I did also struggle with a little bit, Professor Fine, and I'm going to share it here, that when you mentioned cultural issues as number one cause, and then you spoke of archaic IT systems, lack of digital skills, and the fourth in that hierarchy happened to be lack of clear leadership vision. So what I am sort of trying to deal with is, why would that clear leadership vision not be, if not number one, because culture perhaps has now become overwhelming and far more powerful maybe in some ways, because you're not able to change the DNA only because you have a very clear vision. It takes a lot of doing. And I think that's what you got into. Then you got into a lot of doing, and maybe I've answered my own question, but I'm just wondering that, is the leadership taking an easy way out somewhere there? Or that's how, was it a survey filled up by leaders mostly, or was it something which was done by, a large part of the organization's non-so-called leadership roles? So for now, maybe we'll leave that, but if you have a minute, I would love to, get a response from you on that.
Okay.
And yeah, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think that you make a very good point, and I think the interpretation is that in some cases there was clear leadership vision, but there wasn't sufficient leadership skill to manage the cultural issues, right? So the vision was there. This is where we want to be. This is what we want to accomplish, but the skill and capability to get us from here to there just wasn't there. And so the cultural issue, in some cases, we have the vision, we just don't have the ability to change the culture, or the skill to change the culture.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot for elucidating on that. And, the famous Peter Drucker quote, and I know that we are fond of also, sharing that and saying, okay, how culture is so important. And I think once again, you very clearly outlined and reinforced the role of HR. When it comes to being experimental, agile, risk tolerant, all of that in building the right culture. You did that. Moving quickly, where do cultures come from? And I thought that part was absolutely fascinating, which was the last part of what you sort of dealt with and what you shared, and the fact that the habits and the muscles have been developed in a particular way based on the assumptions that have come together over years of maybe success. And those successes, in a way, have gone to the muscle in such a way that now it becomes difficult to, break the old molds, get into new thinking. And I think the way you brought in Daniel Kahneman's work, saying, fast thinking and slow thinking, and the fact that we've got to sometimes not be caught in the automatism or automaticity and thinking slow, which can be very painful, that we are not working only out of our reflex old habits or actions, and consciously look at what we are doing. And the whole role of leadership. But I thought something else which you did, which was very interesting for all of us, which is, and I'm so glad that at the concluding part of the masterclass, we have that from you, which is, so it was almost as if I was anticipating that and saying, okay, so what is the task Professor Fine has now for us? So this is great. This is stuff that, a lot of it, we may not hear it directly from you, and we've had the privilege of, having you with us, and we are listening to you. But yeah, some of it, one can watch it maybe in some of the YouTube videos and say that, okay, understand what culture is all about. So, and then it sort of happened to say that, okay, by the way, here are the 10 commandments, and for you to go and do some homework. So not surprising at all. So there has to be an outcome of the masterclass. So guys, go ahead and check this out. And I'm very sure that all our colleagues, who are there in the audience today, they are going to go and test it out and see what kind of responses actually they get, from within their organizations. And I think it'll be very interesting because that will also offer us a fantastic reason. I don't think with you now we need any more an excuse, Professor Fine. So if you hear from any one of us, I'm pretty sure that you will respond and you let us know. So if it's okay, may I invite on your behalf, our colleagues here, that once they do their homework and that they do wish to reach out to you, we have that license, and that we will hear back from you. That in any case would have happened. We will remind you that, by the way, we were in this session with you, such a, fantastic experience. Wonderful, guys. So you have that from Professor Fine now. So let's go ahead and reach out to him and, continue with this learning process, the learning journey, which has got started so beautifully today. So Professor Fine, with that, again, like I said, 50 minutes of the treat. And I have, like, I don't know how many pages, close to some 10, 11 pages of notes. And I don't think I have touched on each and every, aspect that I made a note of. So I'll also take the license of connecting with you and, understanding some aspects better. But we are hoping that your relationship, and Murli, thanks to you, the relationship with Professor Fine, gets kicked off in such a fantastic way, and that we are able to continue to take benefit of your wisdom. So I know time's at a premium. So Professor Fine, on behalf of National HRD Network, Delhi and NCR team, more importantly, I think from each and every member of the HR community who's been part of this session today, and I'm sure that we are going to be, reaching out and sharing, what we've learned in the session today. We are looking to, let me assure you that, this is a very serious group. We are going to go ahead and also make a very honest attempt on applying and learning from the 10 commandments that you spoke of. And so once again, thank you, deep gratitude, really touched by your generosity in the way you shared all the material with us today, and the amount of, I think, material learning that you packed and then unpacked for us in a span of, no more than those 50 or 55 minutes. So once again, thank you, Professor Fine, and we look forward to continuing the connect with you and learning in the process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alok, for a wonderful summary, and thank you, Professor Fine, for being with us. It has been a wonderful opportunity. Look forward to many more such occasions in future. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alok, for all your kind words. And I have to give you a grade of A+ on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And stay safe. Thank you once again.
I look forward to my next trip to
Alvi, you
India.
may,
Yes.